Good afternoon and welcome to everyone online. My name is Tino Cuellar and I'm the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mexico and the United States are both enormous and intricate countries with outsized stories and importance beyond their own borders. The United States is a major pillar of what was once often referred to as the rules-based international order, and its massive economic and cultural influence are felt in nearly every corner of the world. Then there's Mexico, which looms large in a Latin American region of nearly 700 million people, and also has in myriad ways been a major part of the story of the United States itself. Mexican Americans amount to more than 11% of the entire U.S. population and make up 60% of the Latin origin population in the U.S. Today, a child in Mexico at the border looking north and her American friend looking back across the divide would readily understand that in 100 ways, the American and Mexican stories are forged by an intricate shared history. A history once punctuated by war, but now settled into a complex piece, each country a piece of the other's future as well as its past. Today, the relationship with Mexico is among America's most important, but the global shocks of recent years, from the COVID pandemic to the war in Ukraine, the ongoing Middle East crisis, have turned attentions elsewhere and narrowed the public conversations on this relationship to challenges at their nearly 2,000-mile-long shared border, all too often. To be sure, the two countries face significant shared challenges at the border, including irregular migration, trafficking, organized crime. In mid-2023, there were more than 2 million cases pending in U.S. immigration courts, the most ever on record. Organized criminal groups based in or operating in Mexico are leading suppliers of fentanyl and other illicit narcotics to the U.S. But there's also a story of interconnectedness. In states like California and Texas, hundreds of thousands of people commute across the border each day to work, to attend school, to visit family members, to take part in daily life. Earlier this year, Mexico became America's largest trading partner, surpassing China. Bilateral trade during the first 4 months of 2023 represented over 15% of all the goods exported and imported by the U.S. In addition to growing trade, Mexico is a site for American companies to invest, global firms to move production as part of a growing trend toward nearshoring. And Mexico's economy minister said that some 400 companies were interested in relocating facilities from Asia to Mexico. Nor can we ignore the shared challenges these countries face in a broad range of areas well beyond the border. The climate crisis and extreme weather are affecting agricultural productivity, livelihoods, and coastlines in both countries. Global shocks have had serious effects on the cost of living in both countries, and there's an urgent need to control inflation. And of course, both countries face serious domestic challenges in their democracies. For all these reasons, today's conversation about a more strategic approach to the U.S. Mexico relationship is particularly important. This conversation is part of the broader Pivotal State series by Carnegie's American Statecraft program to consider the trade-offs inherent in America's approach to several key bilateral relationships in the world. To further the discussion in the context of the past, present, and future of the U.S. Mexico story, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists, both of whose work I have followed with interest over the years. Vanda Feldbab-Brown is a senior fellow at the Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, our neighbor. Welcome, Vanda. And Shannon O'Neill is Vice President and Deputy Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she is also the Nelson and David Rockefeller Senior Fellow for Latin American Studies. Moderating today's conversation is Carnegie's very own Chris Chivas, Director of our American Statecraft program. Chris, the floor is yours, and welcome all three of you.
Tino, thank you for that marvelous introduction to our subject today. This is, each of the states that we look at in the Pivotal States series is important in its own way. What strikes me about Mexico may be obvious to many of our audience right now, but I just wanted to call it out. It's that of all of the pivotal states that we have looked at so far in this series, Mexico and U.S. policy towards Mexico has the most direct impact on the lives of American citizens. Clearly, the question of migration across the border and drug trafficking, especially fentanyl, are two issues that are very live and active in American domestic politics today. And this gives the U.S. approach to Mexico is sort of, it makes it in some ways more challenging, but also more important. And obviously, we're going to talk about those two issues, but also get into some of the broader context that Tino just alluded to, because there is an enormous amount that underpins this long and vital relationship. So, as I do in all of these pivotal states episodes, I like to start by thinking about what American interests are when it comes to Mexico, and in particular, how we should think about prioritizing U.S. interests in our approach to Mexico. Because for me, that's the beginning of thinking through what a good sustainable strategy might look like on the part of the United States in its approach to this vital country. And Vanda, I thought I'd start with you to ask you for your thinking about U.S. national interests in Mexico. Why does Mexico matter to the United States? It seems to me that we have a number of interests in Mexico that are in some ways in tension with each other. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about, first of all, what are the top priorities when we think about our national interest to Mexico? Where would you place the most emphasis today in U.S. strategy towards Mexico, and how might you see that evolve over time?
Well, it is really hard to overstate the importance of Mexico to the United States. By the very nature that it's our neighbor, just like with Canada, sharing a long land border, sharing also waters with our country. It is a crucial state in terms of security, and it's very many dimensions that go way beyond crime and way beyond migration. But it is also significant because of economic issues. And moreover, as Tino said in his opening remarks, the United States and Mexico are countries whose societies are deeply intertwined. Not only a significant portion of U.S. citizens of Mexican origin with close family ties to Mexico, but very many Americans live in Mexico. People move there for retirement. They go there for basic services. So prioritizing a wide range of issues with a country that is part of who we are, that's our neighbor, becomes a challenge because a wide set of issues are at play. Those include environmental issues, public health issues, COVID and public health security is very much a matter of cooperating with the closest members and closest neighbors. And it was complicated and difficult for both countries during the COVID relationship. But even before COVID, we had the swine flu, where cooperation with Mexico was crucial from preventing what could have been an epidemic or pandemic really breaking out. So wide set of issues at stake. Of course, what's been dominating political headlines has been migration. And unfortunately, that issue has really dominated a lot of the policy effort as well, squeezing out space from other dimensions. Fentanyl has been also absolutely crucial. Fentanyl is the most challenging public health crisis for the United States. It is killing more Americans between age of 18 and 49 than any other public health matter. And we can talk about the very many devastating aspects of it. 300 Americans dead is a massive crisis. 300 Americans, people dead a day is a massive crisis. There is no underestimating how significant fentanyl is. But finally, there is trade, there is social exchanges. And to say that trade is more important than security would be foolish, but to neglect how important trade and the economic joint growth is would be equally foolish.
Vanda, let me ask you, you've written some great articles in Foreign Affairs and other publications recently, and it seemed to me that it implicit and perhaps even explicit in some of those is the view that U.S. policy towards Mexico is too focused on border migration. Not that it's not important, but that the way that the U.S. has approached Mexico has debilitated its capacity to address some of these other issues, above all, drug trafficking and fentanyl. Is that correct? So would you put less priority on border migration than most people in the United States do right now?
Well, migration is getting huge political attention, obviously, and it's important to very many people. To me, the issue is not to downgrade migration, but not to sacrifice other national interests to the migration issues. and to be able to separate migration from other issues where we need to have tough conversations and frank conversation with the Mexican government. Unfortunately, what has happened since the Trump administration is that Mexican governments, especially the current government of Mexican Andrés Manuel López Obrador, have learned that as long as they control the on and off migration spigot, cooperate with the United States, but also allow migration flows to take place, they can deflect pressure from other issues, such as cooperation on fentanyl, such as the collapse of rule of law in Mexico and the way the criminal groups are really taking over the country. All of that is handled very sort of with velvet gloves, because the migration issue so dominates the agenda. Essentially, it puts the United States in a straitjacket. So what I would really love to see is a robust migration reform at home that will allow us to have regular and regularized flows of migrants, so that we are not in this constraint, in this straitjacket bind that migration has become, and the leverage this gives the Mexican government not to do important things it needs to do internally for its own interest and in the bilateral relationship.
There's a lot of things that I want to ask you about there, but let me first ask Shannon to come in. And Shannon, you've looked at these issues both from the perspective of a political scientist, but also from the perspective of a political economist, I think that's the accurate way to describe your work. When you think about the U.S. Mexico relationship, how do you think about U.S. interests in Mexico?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all. And, Mexico is an interesting country for the United States, because while it isn't always as urgent as some places like Ukraine or other places where you see wars and you see this, it is always important. And you look at the scope of the relationship, and, Vanda just laid out a lot, but, to echo that, from the food that's on our table, to the cars we drive, to the air we breathe, to the illegal drugs we consume, to the communities we inhabit, Mexico is part of this. And it's part of it, as Tino said at the beginning, it's part of it along the border, but it really is part of it throughout the United States. You look at, the importance of Mexico's economy, of its people, of all these different factors for dozens and dozens of U.S. states. It's their number one trading partner. It's the number one, place that they're exporting to and the like. So it's a huge aspect of, there's a huge national interest at the state level, but at the federal level. The other thing is, I look at U.S. national security policy and its evolution over recent years, and particularly this growing concern with the economy in national security and securing supply chains in national security, and particularly critical ones, whether it's semiconductors or large capacity batteries, electric vehicle batteries, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, the things that have been laid out as strategic here. As you look around the world, Mexico provides, I think, the most viable commercial solution to those challenges. How do you secure so population has access to medicines, has access to technologies, has access to critical minerals? Mexico is a big part of that solution as well, as you look around trying to solve that problem. So in terms of U.S. national security interests, there are lots of those there. There's the drug issue and the like, but a safer and more vibrant, economically vibrant Mexico is incredibly important for national security, because it reverberates into the United States across all of these different dimensions.
I want to ask both of you about what a realistic vision for the future of U.S.-Mexico relations is. But before I do that, Shannon, let me ask you to develop just a little bit the rationale for why you think Mexico is, the most commercially viable, site for what some people call nearshoring, or the diversification of supply chains. What is it about Mexico that makes it, such a great candidate for this broad national security objective that most people seem to share at least since COVID, if not earlier?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of two elements to that. There are the specific strategic sectors, right? Electric vehicle batteries or semiconductors. And there, if you really want to have secure supply chains from, countries of concern and the like, you have to pull them out of Asia. You have to move it away from, at this point, China. There's other countries, obviously, that are on that list of concerns. And as you start thinking about, it's very hard to imagine the U.S. government is going to subsidize indefinitely these industries, right? They have to be commercially competitive, at least after you get startup costs by with the global economy, with other supply chains in Asia or Europe or other parts of the world. And so start thinking about that, right? In semiconductors, yes, we're spending tens of billions of dollars to build fabs in Arizona and New York and other places, but if you really want to secure the supply chain for semiconductors, it can't just be the high-tech fab. It has to be the whole supply chain, from the inputs to the testing and packaging. And that whole supply chain has to be commercially competitive with those that are based in Taiwan or China or elsewhere today in the world. So as you think about that, you need more than one country, more than one state. You need to make sure that those supply chains are broader. And Mexico has advantages. It has advantages in terms of preferred access to the U.S. economy, right? It has the USMCA, so the trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, so that there's the ability to move things back and forth. It has a significant labor force, and some that has, well-trained technicians and the like that could take on parts of that supply chain, or electric vehicle battery supply chains, or others and the like. It has the proximity that allows for back and forth in terms of logistics and the like. So there's a lot of benefits that it has there with access to and ties to the United States. And it has now almost 30 years worth of a pretty deep ecosystem of advanced manufacturing capability with the United States. And when you talk to companies in any of these strategic areas or any areas writ large, one of the challenges with moving supply chains is not just, could I move one factory, but will I have suppliers? Will I have inputs? Will I have markets? Will I have distribution? Will I have the logistics? Or you can't make it a viable commercial entity if you don't have that whole system. And because of the ties between Mexico and Canada and the United States over these last 25, 30 years through NAFTA, now through the USMCA, you do have a pretty deep ecosystem where you can replicate and then compete with, say, those ecosystems that have developed and deepened in Asia or other parts of the world. So I think that's a big part of it. The other thing I would put on the table, which is not strict national security, but is also incredibly important for the United States and the politics we were talking about, is, one of the biggest concerns in the US is how are we going to be globally competitive, right? Economically, how are companies that are based in the United States, how are they going to thrive and be able to sell to US consumers, but those all around the world? And as you look at the global economy and its evolution over these last 30, 40 years, the way that companies have been competitive, the way that they have thrived is through international supply chains, through divvying up the production across countries, right? No country, not China, not the United States, successfully goes it alone. And that, I think, as the United States thinks about, okay, how are we going to have more US-based companies able to thrive, able to create US jobs and sell to, 8 billion consumers around the world? You're going to need to have international supply chains. And there again, Mexico, along with Canada and a number of other nations, they provide a solution to that problem where you can have regional production that then allows you to be competitive globally and vis-a-vis other Asian and other supply chains that are deepening every day.
It occurs to me that what you describe would amount to an intensification of trends towards regionalization as opposed to globalization that have been in process now for several decades. Let me ask Vanda, how do you see the promise of an even deeper economic relationship with Mexico? How do you see the potential for Mexico to play the kind of role that Shannon has just laid out for us? How do you see it, especially in relation to some of the other priorities that we know are out there, including border migration across the border, drug trafficking, the environment, and some of the others that we've touched on so far?
Well, Shannon laid out a vision what would be ideal scenario of deeper economic integration with Mexico and equally with Canada. And she spoke about many of the advantages that our two neighbors, Mexico and Canada, have, from geographic proximity to some of the resource supplies based. And we are already seeing deglobalization. We are seeing the movement to nearshoring or friendshoring, which accounts for the fact that Mexico is now the #1 trading partner, having surpassed China in doing so. But Mexico also suffers from enormous challenges. The most significant and fundamental one, affecting every aspect of life, is collapsed rule of law in the country. That the country has really not been able to significantly improve and resurrect since the late 1980s. This is playing out with the United States. Mexico is the principal source of fentanyl and methamphetamine for the United States. It's also The Mexican criminal entities have a wide variety of impacts in the United States. They are, for example, a very significant source of fraud, such as wealthy Americans. But even more acutely and intensely, the collapsed rule of law, the expansion of the power of criminal groups is playing out in Mexico. It is not something that's separate from the lives of Mexican people. Criminal groups have daily presence and impact on the lives of very many Mexicans. They are essentially ruling larger and larger parts of Mexican territory. They are deeply implicated, involved in manipulating elections. They are taking over legal economies in Mexico. It's kind of notorious that if you buy an avocado in the United States from Mexico, you have paid money to a cartel. Well, you can extend that to corn, to citrus. In Mexico itself, water distribution to Mexican citizens is essentially deeply penetrated, I would perhaps even use a stronger term, by Mexican criminal groups. So very many domains of what the state should be in charge of are at minimum interfered with and sometimes outright controlled by vicious criminal groups. And for the vision of the two countries integrating deeply economically, for the nearshoring, friendshoring to intensify requires rule of law in Mexico. And we have the opposite of it. This is playing out, including in the economic domains. Criminal groups like the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación control roads. We saw in Tijuana narco blockades just several months ago, where this should really have been a wake-up call, an alarm clock going off for the Mexican government, that a place that's the location of the fiestas in the nearshoring parties, Tijuana, San Diego, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación can blockade major highways and access to the border for several hours or days. And that story in Tijuana is rather typical of what happens in various parts of the country.
Shannon, do you want to, what do you think about that? I mean, what are the left and right boundaries of our aspirations for, what kind of limitations, I should say, do you see on the potential for Mexico to play the role that you've laid out?
There are definitely limitations, right? And you look at we talk a lot about nearshoring and the like, but what you've seen is, a stream of money coming in there, not a tsunami. Other countries have really, as you've seen money move out of China or production move out of China, there are other countries around the world that have really received more than Mexico, right? Vietnam, Indonesia, Poland, India, even the United States itself. So I think there is, a tempered aspect here. The challenges are obviously, as Vanda says, the rule of law is a huge issue. And especially as you move down these supply chains, the big multinationals sometimes can have more cover. They can pay for, the security or get the attention of the governors and the like in order to, deal with some of the challenges they face. But the suppliers, who are often smaller, you go down the tiers of suppliers, those are often those that really have a significant challenge in terms of creating this. So that's one challenge. There's other challenges that Mexico faces today. One of the biggest ones is access to energy, and particularly clean energy, right? As all of these companies have made climate promises and, net neutral in terms of their carbon footprint and the like over the next, decade or 2 decades and the like, not having access to clean energy in your manufacturing is a no-go for your shareholders or for the things that you promised. And that is a challenge that this government in particular has increased in terms of Mexico. There's also infrastructure challenges in Mexico, right? They haven't invested in the kinds of infrastructure that would really allow the manufacturing boom you're seeing in some other places, particularly Asia, occur. So there are limits to this. But as I look at U.S. national security interests, and as we try to think about how are we going to meet these goals that we've set for resilience across critical industries and the like, this is probably the easiest part of the solution. Now, of course, it means you need a willing partner. You need a partner who's going to invest and work with you on these various sides. But as I look at the various options out there in terms of it, this is probably the easiest way to go. And it is a country with, for the good, the bad, the ugly, and the like, we've had a long and very deep and rich and often complicated relationship. But it is one that has been a long-term ally, and one where we have met them. And, we agree to disagree on certain things. There's always complications in a relationship, but that's partly because it's such a deep, complicated relationship. I mean, you go to the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, it's one of the biggest embassies in the world, which shows sort of the importance. But there are also dozens and dozens of agencies with representatives there, and that shows how important Mexico is on, all sides of a life. It's the security issues Manda's talking about, it's the agricultural issues, it's commerce, it's all of these aspects are there.
This is really interesting. For our audience, this is Pivotal States. I'm Chris Chivas, the director of the American Statecraft Program, and we're here talking about Mexico with two great experts bringing different perspectives to thinking about how the United States might adopt a more robust and effective strategy towards this vital nation. We're going to start taking questions from the audience in the next couple of minutes. But before I do that, I want to go sort of directly to a question which we've mentioned in passing but not hit right on, which is the question of what is really the big challenge here for the United States. It wants to accomplish a number of things that are absolutely essential in U.S. domestic politics, for geopolitical reasons, for transnational reasons. We're talking about climate, but we seem to be really struggling to make progress. And Vanda, you mentioned rule of law, so that's part of the challenge. But it also is state capacity, right? And it's potentially political will in Mexico. Is that correct? Or give me your thoughts about it, Vanda. How should we think about what's the big thing that's stopping us from moving forward on these fronts?
Well, the rubric for all three, Chris, would be the quality of governance. That governance in Mexico has had decades of challenges. Remember, this was an authoritarian country, or a country without free and fair elections until the year 2000. And along that period and continually since, even after democratization, and democracy has suffered from very powerful criminal groups and very weak rule of law, extensive corruption, extensive engagement of government officials at all levels of government with criminal groups and vice versa. But nonetheless, after democratization, Mexico achieved some significant progress. There was robust institutional strengthening in a variety of domains, highly talented technocratic class. One of the big issues in the economic relationship is relatively low level of productivity of Mexican workers. Education is a massive challenge, but at the same time, you have top level technocratic class in the country. And we have seen over the past 2 decades significant progress in civil service reform, in the quality of institutions, until the current government of President Manuel López Obrador, that, like President Trump, has seen the state as a core source of problem. President López Obrador talks about the fourth transformation that he envisioned Mexico to be going through, that he's shepherding Mexico toward, and that includes dismantling and undermining many of the institutional reforms I would posit were crucial and important elements of progress, elements of improvement, and vital for the ability to integrate further economically. So we have seen massive degradations of institutions, enormously shrunk budgets. We have seen great militarization of public policy, not just security, public policy in Mexico, weakening of very many aspects of institutional checks and balances, and really very strong anti-democratic authoritarian tendencies of the current government, all of which will last way after the sexennial, the 6 years of the president ends in 2024 and new president comes in. So Mexico, over the past 5-6 years, really lost a lot of the progress that was crucial for the country to achieve much greater social equity and to be able to be a robust partner. Now, overlaying this decline in the quality of governance is the aspect of will that you spoke about, that on very many issues, President López Obrador has not seen eye to eye with the United States. In fact, he exhibits quite strong anti-American tendencies in very many ways, often embraces President Putin, embraces all kinds of other problematic actors and problematic policy developments for the United States that are more GRU, the Russian intelligence service agents in Mexico than in any other Latin American country. And this has happened under President López Obrador. So on the one hand, he wants economic integration. He is focused on growth in Mexico, but at the same time, he is very much a politician of the 1950s Mexican mold with strong dislike and antipathy toward the United States. And his legacy in the deinstitutionalization will be hurting Mexico and the bilateral relationship for years to come.
And that's part of what hampers America's ability to do things that I think many people would want to see, for example, on security cooperation between our law enforcement agencies. Part of this is
absolutely. I mean,
attitudes, right?
Yeah, no, President López Obrador just decimated law enforcement cooperation between the two countries. And, it's not zero as it was for a while at the beginning of his administration, especially after the United States arrested former Mexican Secretary of Defense, General Salvador Cienfuegos, on drug trafficking charges. It's not zero, but it's weak and it's nowhere where it needs to be. And it's nowhere where it needs to be for the United States, but it's nowhere where it needs to be for Mexico. There is, for all practical purposes, no law enforcement strategy in Mexico for pushing back the criminal groups that are eating Mexico alive.
Shannon, do you see the main obstacle to the United States pursuing the future that it would like to have with Mexico? Do you see the challenge the same way? I mean, how much does it have to do with López Obrador? How much does it have to do with other challenges, other problems that we face in the relationship?
I think there's a set of the challenges, and some of them are domestic. In part, what Vanda's talking about, sort of the challenges of the rule of law and the like. One of their biggest political challenges in Mexico is we really have a tale here of two countries. And right, in Vanda, when you look at the national statistics, she's right? Productivity has not grown. Growth has been slow, 2% a year for 25 years. But when you actually look at the sub-national level and you divide it up again, you see very different outcomes. You look at the north of Mexico, and there productivity has been growing double digits for decades. Growth in those states has been growing 8, 9, 10%. And we're talking Asian tiger, China rates for 15, 20 years. What's happened, though, is the south of Mexico has become less productive. Growth has shrunk in those areas. So you're seeing a divide. And part of the volatile politics of Mexico that brought in López Obrador and others is these divides, sort of the have and have nots. And, we look here in the United States and you look at divides. I grew up in Ohio. I now live in New York. We see differences in the politics of those two states. Mexico has that, but on steroids. It's, much more significant. And I think the polarization is even deeper. And so one of the challenges within Mexico are these divides. You have a north that is growing in significant ways, is becoming a much more, it's an emerging market, but it's becoming a much more sophisticated, advanced manufacturing base. And you have a south that is being left behind, and that's leading to all kinds of political challenges that make it hard there within that country to govern. So that's one set of challenges. The other then is when you have someone overseeing that and someone who's been elected given those volatile politics is how do you work or not with the United States? And, López Obrador has been, interestingly, he does have, rhetorically, he talks, sort of, Mexico standing up to the United States in various ways. But when push comes to shove, this is an administration that has worked with the United States. It's worked with the United States on migration to a greater extent than any Mexican administration that I can remember or have, look back in the history. It has worked with the United States on a host of other issues. This is the administration that negotiated and ratified the USMCA and has by and large, gone along with all kinds of new mechanisms there, whether they're environmental ones or labor ones and the like. And so There are areas that, the rhetoric is sometimes about independence and the like, but often when push comes to shove, you see the two nations working together on those. The one area that is different, and Vanda brought up, is we've seen really a diminishing of security cooperation in many ways here, and that really is a challenge, and one that the next administration, because Mexico, we are about to have presidential elections here in the 2024. So is Mexico, and we will see there, because the president cannot run again for office. We will see a new president come into Mexico October 1 of 2024.
Yeah, and obviously, as you say, here too, potentially, which could, usher in a whole new phase in the bilateral relationship. I mean, there is a lot of frustration in the United States about the relationship with Mexico. Obviously, both border migration, but also fentanyl in particular. It's just been such a big issue this year that we're seeing some proposals come out of Congress and other parts of the country that are pretty hard line. And I think it's worth asking what the pros and cons of some of those proposals are. For example, some members of Congress have discussed the possibility of an authorization for the use of military force against the cartels. There's been talk about designating them as foreign terrorist organizations. Vanda, what do you think are the pros and cons of that kind of an approach to Mexico?
Well, I think there really are no significant pros to military action into Mexico. Mm-hmm. So whether this would be the use of drones, for example, or special operations forces, one can imagine a set of targets. Now, the easiest targets will be in the mountains of Chihuahua, Sinaloa, and some of the parts of Mexico. But they will be very limited on what they can actually accomplish. So yes, they will be able to take down a lab. They will be able to arrest a certain amount of cartel members, none of which really have a significant impact. What we need is for Mexico to find a will to start taking back its sovereignty. Mexico is often complaining about the gringos, the imperialist gringos, undermining its sovereignty. And it has good reasons to have painful memories of this and to be prideful and to guard its sovereignty. But the reality is that the criminal groups have taken Mexico's sovereignty away from the Mexican people and even from the Mexican state and government. So what we really need is for the Mexican people and the Mexican government administration to realize that for their own reasons, they need to be moving back against the cartels. And this is not what's going to be set off, stimulated by any kind of U.S. military action into Mexico. In fact, that agenda, in my view, would be worsened. There are Mexican law enforcement officials, there are Mexican military officials, there are Mexican people who are enormously frustrated in how the cartels are undermining their lives. They would like to see far more robust cooperation, and they would like to see far smarter security policies in Mexico. Well, even those voices would really be hampered in the ability to embrace cooperating with the United States if we had some military action. Now, the issue of designating criminal groups as foreign terrorist entities is a more complex one, and there are some real positives to that. So let me start with the negative. So the negative is this is enormously politically explosive in Mexico, and we would likely see some retaliation of Mexican policy. I am actually not thrilled about the migration cooperation. I think that emphasizing the migration cooperation, emphasizing migration as part of the security agenda just constantly reinforces this very problematic lesson that the Trump administration taught Mexico, that namely that as long as it cooperates on migration and turns the spigot on and off, it can get away with non-cooperating on a whole other set of issues. It can get away with violating democracy, human rights, civil liberties in Mexico. So I would like us to move away from the dependence on Mexico on the migration controls. But nonetheless, designating would be politically and diplomatically sensitive and explosive, though nowhere as much as a military action. The real huge big downside would be the economic implications. So as I mentioned, the Mexican criminal groups are deeply implicated and infiltrated into very many legal economies in Mexico. They are taking over legal fisheries, logging, mining. They're also extorting a wide variety of agricultural industrial actors in Mexico. Paying extortion fees might be necessary for survival for the conduct of business, but it's certainly in violation of material support clauses. Those carry very significant penalties into the United States, and they carry penalties for U.S. partners, U.S. businesses engaging with those who provide material support. If the foreign terrorist organization designation took place, the penalties for material support would be far greater. And so you could have real implications on downgrading and jeopardizing the economic trade, the outsourcing, the nearshoring that we have been talking about. On the plus side, one of the advantages of designation is this would significantly boost the priority that the United States accords to intelligence gathering. You would think that even though the Mexican cartels are and the fentanyl smuggling are killing more Americans than any other issue, we would have high prioritization, the National Intelligence Collection Priority List. In fact, collecting on China and Russia, both of which are playing in Mexico, is far more important than collecting on the cartels. So designation would boost collections. It would allow a wide set of actors to collect intelligence as well as engage in operations. So it would really enable far greater whole of government approach. Now, the Biden administration very strongly and appropriately emphasizes whole of government approach to fentanyl. What I would really like us to move toward is whole of government approach to cartels, and not just their fentanyl smuggling, but all of their other operations, whether it's fraud against U.S. citizens, whether it's takeover of environmental economies, fishing, to counter all of their illicit activities and their connections to actors such as in China.
Shannon, how do you view some of these proposals for a more direct application of U.S. force, or listing of the cartels as foreign terrorist organizations? Do you take them? How seriously do you take them? Do you see positive and negative, or mostly just negative consequences flowing from them? And what alternatives would you put high on the priority list?
Yeah, so the concern is real. And I was a participant, but also the chair of a bipartisan congressional commission where we looked at U.S. drug policy. And for 18 months, we stood up a commission and looked at these issues. And I will say, when I went and testified, when we gave the report to Congress, and when I testified on it, question after question, whether from red or blue or purple districts, whether Senate or House, it was, we have people dying in our districts of fentanyl overdoses, of drug overdoses. How do we protect our families, our kids, our communities from this? So it is a real concern. And 70,000 people overdosed last year from fentanyl, right? We look at the way the U.S. government lays out investigatory resources from the Treasury that go after money laundering and the like, and we focus on terrorist groups that didn't kill 70,000 Americans last year and will again this coming year if things continue. So this is a real concern. In terms of these proposals out there, I mean, you look at these networks, these are illicit networks, this is organized crime. There isn't a place to bomb, right? They aren't all in a certain place. And we see that, you think about sort of the insurgents, they're not even insurgents, right? This is an illegal business that is a brutal business, but it is an illegal business. And so it's not you're not facing a military, though they are militarized. This is much more of a dispersed set of illegal economies, and you can't get at it by bombing it, right? And so I think that is the challenge for the U.S. military actions or the like, right? This is a financial business that you need to take down in a financial way. The other challenge with designating as a terrorist organization, and Vanda lays out some of it, is that what happens to the American consumer of illegal drugs, the kid who wants to go get into rehab, but because they bought drugs from a Mexican cartel labeled a terrorist is providing material support. Do you throw them in jail for supporting terrorists because they bought drugs? I mean, you could think about the reverberations through U.S. communities, not just the businesses, but the consumers of these. And that is not the point here, right? But what we did find in this commission is we can, without that designation, with the designation that we already have from, OFAC, from, this is an organized crime group and the like, there's a lot of things you can do. You could move resources. You could go after these financial networks. You could have, for banks that, process this money and the flows. There's a lot that you could do to find these flows, track these flows, stop these flows that keep these businesses going. So it is, it is an incredibly important issue. It will, as we've already been talking about, you need the Mexican government alongside. One of the biggest challenges, Mexico spends less than 1% of its GDP on security writ large. You just can't make a country secure if you're only spending that amount of money. Mm. Also, as we've seen over this last administration, a move away from state and local police officers and building up of those civilian forces to a focus on the military. That too, you don't solve a problem like this by surgical strikes into communities and pulling back, right? You need community policing. You need to know who are the people who are participating in these networks, and then finding a way to bring rule of law through, community by community. The one thing I will say is you look at Mexico's own history, you look at a history of other countries like Colombia that have had huge challenges in these kinds of ways, but you look at Mexico's own history, we have seen successful cases where communities have taken back their safety and their streets from these criminal organizations, at least in large part. So, you look back at the early 2010s in Ciudad Juarez, which is across the border from El Paso, it was the most dangerous city in the world. It's still not, the safest place in the world, but it's so much better. And partly that was local police, local community, business leaders, civil society, people really came together. You've seen a similar thing in Monterrey, which is the hub for all of this nearshoring that's happening in Mexico today. Similarly, they had moments that were incredibly difficult in terms of security and violence, and they've been able to bring back from some of those brinks. So this isn't an unsolvable problem, I would say. This is not a hopeless problem that can't be solved. It is going to be incredibly difficult because organized crime has penetrated more local governments, state level governments, other parts of the economy and the like. But there are examples in Mexico itself where you've seen communities come back from these very difficult places.
Well, I would make two comments on it. One is that unfortunately, in many of the places where progress was achieved, it was not sustained. Ciudad Juarez is a prime example, and along with the mobilization of the civil society, business community in places like Tijuana, like Ciudad Juarez, a critical underlying factor was the victory of one cartel, in both cases Sinaloa. That is now challenged, and so we're seeing big spikes of violence in both places. More importantly, the advantage that the temporary narco peace brought to those communities has really not been seized and sustained to improve law enforcement and policing. And this has now been compounded over the past 5 years under the López Obrador administration by a willful policy on the part of the federal government not to support any efforts to resist the cartels. I was in Mexico for 6 weeks in the summer. I was in Mexico just recently for a while. I cannot tell you how many times over the past 5 years that I've been coming in, and on these trips, I hear from local officials, from local people about the security challenges in their daily lives, from major businesses that are threatened by the narcos. And the key theme is we have no backup from the federal government. Oftentimes we have no backup from the government. How do we resist the cartels, their pressure, their desire to take over our business if we have no backup to take them on? And that is what Mexico needs to confront.
I want to turn to some of the questions that we've been getting from our audience here. We have a couple of questions that specifically relate to China and how we should be thinking about China's relationship with Mexico, in particular, as a provider of precursor chemicals for fentanyl. How should that factor into U.S. policy towards Mexico and overall? And then also on the economic front, what would it mean if China were to invest much more heavily in the Mexican economy. Would we still be able to say that there has been meaningful nearshoring if it turns out that the Chinese government or other investors have a major, gain a major role in the Mexican economy in the process? Vanda, maybe let me start with you on the fentanyl one in particular. I mean, how should we think about the relationship between China and Mexico when it comes to fentanyl?
Well, both Mexico and China are two crucial countries. China has been the principal supplier of precursor chemicals for fentanyl and, for that matter, for methamphetamine, both of which are manufactured overwhelmingly in Mexico. So today, the vast majority of all fentanyl consumed in the United States, all methamphetamine, and frankly, the vast majority of other drugs coming in other than cocaine, are manufactured in Mexico. China is the source of precursor chemicals for both. Unfortunately, over the past 3 years, and very intensely so with China over the past 18 months, we have had no meaningful law enforcement cooperation at all, zero. It was not quite, Mexico was not quite as bad. We had occasionally the Mexican government would act on some U.S. enforcement efforts and desires, but it was zero with China. The Biden administration invested very strongly in diplomacy on China, very difficult diplomacy. China has a very different view of law enforcement than the Biden administrations and the United States. The United States would like to see law enforcement cooperation to be separate and immune from the geostrategic relationship, which obviously has tanked. We are at the period of a new Cold War with China, intense competition. China subordinates law enforcement cooperation to the geostrategic relationship. And as the geostrategic relationships and the competition ramped up in very many different domains, China pulled back from cooperating. But in both countries, there has been an effort to put a floor underneath the collapse of the relationship, underneath the intensification of the tensions to stabilize the relationship. And that has paid off in the recent summit between President Biden and President Xi. President Xi has again committed himself to cooperating on stopping the flow of precursors from China. I am not holding my breath as to how robust and how long-lasting that will be. But any cooperation for some months is absolutely better than zero cooperations that we have had. China has already taken some actions. It has sent out notices across the Chinese chemical industries that it will start cracking down on precursor flows. It has acted on some of the companies, entities that the United States has indicted. So there is some action. How long, how robust, how much effect it will have, yet all to be seen. But kudos very much to the Biden administration from getting us from zero China willful non-cooperation on law enforcement to some cooperation. And I hope that we can get to far more cooperation with Mexico, and that the cooperation will not be reduced and deflected to these occasional high-value target arrests, such as of Ovidio Guzman or El Nini, the leader of the Chapitos.
Very interesting. Shannon, maybe for you, the economic question. I mean, again, as you know, China-U.S. trade is taking off, and given all of the promise for China as a site for nearshoring that you've described in very convincingly here, to what extent should we be thinking about Chinese investment in Mexico and having much of the production that we're importing from Mexico simply be Chinese firms and production simply in Mexico? Is that something that we should care about? Should we be concerned about it? Does it matter? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think it depends what the nearshoring is for, let's say. So, historically, you look at Mexico and China's relationship, and Mexico was, unlike South American nations where their economies were complements, right? You saw all these South American nations, huge booms in commodity sales because China was, using up iron ore and copper and soy and beef and everything and sending back manufactured goods. Mexico has always been a bit of a competitor, right? They made the same kinds of things. They made shoes and toys and electronics and these sorts of things. And China often bested Mexico. We talk here in the United States about the China shock and the jobs lost. Well, Mexico lost more jobs per capita for sure, if not in absolute terms, because of China's rise and because they were in direct competition over so many of those jobs in the early 2000s. Today, you look, so there wasn't for many years much Chinese investment in Mexico, but you have started to see just in the last few years more. So it's starting off with a small base, but it's growing. And I think the question for U.S. national security and U.S. interests is, what are they investing in, right? Do we really care if it's Chinese investment in Mexico that the washing machines that are coming in from Mexico are? Does that really matter? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not sure that washing machine is a national security concern, right?
Probably not.
Or those shoes, right? Those Nike shoes. If they're coming from Mexico and they're not coming from China, does it really matter, right? But if Huawei technology goes into Mexico's telecommunication grids, especially those near the border, if it is Chinese EVs and EV technology that then is investing in Mexico and getting the subsidies that are part of the IRA, because Mexico is part of that, both for critical minerals and for the manufacturing part, they might best US-based companies. That would be really a technological, breakthrough. So I think it really matters what the investment is. Not all investment is a threat to our national security, but there are specific sectors. And look, the US government, both the executive branch, but Congress have laid out what some of those, strategic sectors are. That sort of, however you want to phrase it, that small garden, high wall. I would be concerned if a lot of the investment going into Mexico from China were in those technologically sensitive areas, and then using access through USMCA, the trade agreement, or other things to come into the US market.
Just to add to that, we are unfortunately again in the situation where the current Mexican administration has been indifferent to US concerns, accepting highly sensitive Chinese technologies with the potential of backdoor spying along the US-Mexico border, for example. Mexican criminal groups are also nearshoring into Mexico. There is big rise and intensification of the presence of Chinese criminal groups that are engaged in a variety of highly complex relationships beyond drugs with the Mexican cartels. Many of the Chinese criminal networks are also connected to Chinese government officials. China regularly uses criminal actors as a tool, as a systematic tool in its foreign policy for a whole variety of domain, from espionage and intelligence to punishing and controlling the diaspora. And in the U.S.-Mexico context, we are seeing a big growth of the role of Chinese money laundering actors on both sides of the border, also in the United States.
Let me ask you both a final question here. This has been a great conversation, and I very much appreciate it. If you had, a few minutes in the Oval Office with the president, what would be at the top of your list to request of him that he do differently in shaping America's approach to Mexico? Shannon, can you tell us what you would say?
I think the first thing is that this is a really broad relationship, and don't let it be held hostage to migration, which we have seen, not just this administration, I would say the administration before, that was the choice. There's so many things that are important. And two is that as the United States, frankly, looks for answers to these national security concerns, these economic and commercial national security concerns, rather than spending so many calories on IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and in countries that are on the other side of the Pacific, that right here at home is actually where you're going to find more viable solutions.
And you've written about that latter a fair amount, and I commend your articles to everyone's attention. Vanda, what about you? What would you say?
If we cannot conduct meaningful migration reform in the US, then we need to find a way to separate migration from other issues so that we can be engaging and demanding, when necessary, cooperation from Mexico on other set of issues that are vital for the United States. Security, the role of foreign actors in Mexico, Russia, China, but also push strongly and embrace the collapse of rule of law, the degradation of democracy, the authoritarian tendencies. Stand up to reverse that in Mexico. And that means escaping the migration policy straitjacket.
It seems like escaping that policy straitjacket is really the only way to get upstream in this relationship and try to work towards a broader, longer-term future that that's there. There is a future for U.S. Mexico relations that's a lot better than where we are today. And I thank both of you for helping us to think about what that looks like, both implicitly and explicitly, through your participation in this today. Thank you both. Really enjoyed this and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Great speaking with you, Chris and Shannon.